She wore the ugliest thing she owned: oversized glasses, scuffed boots held together by habit, hair scraped back like she'd already given up. Maribel Quinn walked into the most expensive restaurant in the city, dressed like she'd crawled out of a dumpster. Because that was the plan. Look worthless, get rejected, walk away free. Her family had sold her future to erase their debts, handed her to a man who reportedly owned judges, politicians, and graveyards. All she had to do was make him not want her. Simple. Except the man across the table smiled, and that smile destroyed everything. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one goes deep. The reservation was under Quinn. Maribel knew because she'd called the restaurant herself 3 days ago, using the voice she reserved for people she needed to fool. Calm, flat, bureaucratic. She'd asked for a corner table near the emergency exit, and the hostess had said of course without hesitation because the name attached to the reservation, the name of the man she was supposed to meet, carried enough weight in this city to rearrange furniture. She hadn't eaten all day. Not from nerves. From calculation. She needed her hands steady and her head clear and her face carrying the particular brand of exhaustion that made beautiful women look plain. She'd practiced in the bathroom mirror for 2 hours the night before, studying the lines around her eyes, the tension in her jaw, the way her mouth defaulted to something between a frown and a blank when she stopped performing. She was good at performing. She'd been doing it her whole life. Tonight she needed to perform the opposite, the anti-performance, the girl who had nothing to offer. She took the crosstown bus instead of a cab, sat near the back, watched the city slide past the smeared window, all lit up and indifferent, and felt the familiar pressure behind her sternum that she'd learned to identify not as fear exactly, but as the physical sensation of having no good options. Her father had presented the arrangement over breakfast 3 weeks ago, presented it the way he presented everything now, with the careful diction of a man trying to sound reasonable while the walls came down around him. Orson Quinn, 61 years old, former real estate developer, current catastrophe in a linen shirt. He'd set a folder on the kitchen table between the orange juice and the toast and said, "There's a man who's agreed to clear our debts, and in exchange you'll meet him." And Maribel had stared at the folder and understood immediately that the word meet was doing a tremendous amount of work in that sentence. She hadn't opened the folder right away. She'd finished her coffee first, let the silence sit, watched her father not meet her eyes, and felt the last residue of something she might have once called love for him quietly calcify into something harder and more useful. Inside the folder was a single page. A name, Cassian Vale. A photograph, and the outline of an arrangement that her father described as a contract of intent, which was a phrase invented specifically to avoid using the word that actually applied. She'd taken the page to her room, sat on the edge of her bed with it, looked at the photograph for a long time. Cassian Vale was not what she'd expected from a man her father owed money to, which was to say he did not look like her father's usual creditors, the soft-bellied developers and leveraged investors who moved through the same circles Orson used to move through before those circles contracted. Cassian Vale looked like something built, not born. Tall in the photograph, though it was hard to tell scale, dark hair, a jaw that looked like it had been used to make decisions. The eyes were what stayed with her after she put the photograph down. There was nothing warm in them, nothing performative. Just a flat, steady intelligence that looked at the camera the same way, she suspected, it looked at everything, measuring the distance between what a thing appeared to be and what it actually was. She'd done her own research after that. Careful research, the kind that left no trail. What she found confirmed the shape of what her father had already implied and added dimensions to it that made her chest feel tight. Cassian Vale was 38. He controlled 7 legitimate corporations, 2 private equity funds, and a real estate portfolio that included, among other things, the building her father's failed development company had once competed against. He sat on 3 charitable boards and had never been charged with anything. He had also, according to the kind of sources that didn't publish things but knew them anyway, been personally responsible for the structural reorganization of the city's most significant criminal enterprise over the past decade. He did not deal in drugs. He dealt in influence, in contracts, in the quiet suffocation of opposition. Men who crossed him did not typically end up dead. They ended up irrelevant, which in this city was worse. He had never been married. He had never been publicly linked to any woman for longer than a season. He had, as far as Maribel could determine, expressed no prior interest in acquiring a wife. Until now. Until her father put her in a folder. She got off the bus 2 blocks from the restaurant and stood on the sidewalk for a moment in the November cold, breathing. The thrift store wool sweater she'd chosen was the color of old mustard and had a small moth hole near the left shoulder. She'd found the glasses at the back of a drawer, an old prescription from 5 years ago that made the world slightly wavy if she kept them on too long. The boots were genuine. She'd owned them since college, and had never bothered to replace them because replacing them would have required caring about the kind of impression she made, and she'd spent most of her adult life carefully engineering the opposite of that. The whole outfit had cost her $32, and the complete sacrifice of any residual vanity she might have harbored. She looked, she knew, like exactly the kind of woman a billionaire would not want to marry. That was the point. Get in, make him dismiss her in the first 10 minutes. Get out. Go home and tell her father it hadn't worked out and watch him spiral into whatever came next, which was not her problem, because she had decided somewhere between the research and the bus ride that she was done being her father's solution. The restaurant was called Evander. She'd looked it up. Tasting menu only, prix fixe, 18 courses, 2 Michelin stars, reservation wait list. 14 months. Unless your name was Vale. The front was all dark glass and soft lighting, the kind of place that communicated exclusivity through understatement. A man in a black coat held the door. He looked at her outfit without expression, which told her he was very well trained. Inside, the maitre d' found her name and walked her through the room with the smooth efficiency of someone accustomed to discretion. The restaurant was not large, maybe 30 tables, each set with white linen and a single candle. The clientele were the kind of people who wore their money quietly. The real money. The kind that didn't need to announce itself. Several of them glanced at Maribel as she passed. She felt the glances the way you feel a temperature change. The specific social reading of someone who doesn't belong. She'd felt it before. She'd grown up adjacent to rooms like this and had never quite been admitted to them. And the feeling was familiar in the way old wounds are familiar, dull and located, and not particularly surprising. The corner table near the back. He was already there. She'd prepared for this. She'd rehearsed a specific sequence of behaviors, the distracted fumbling with the chair, the failure to make eye contact, the careful projection of a woman too dull and damaged to be worth the investment of a powerful man's attention. She'd prepared for this the way she prepared for everything she was afraid of, by reducing it to a tactical problem and then solving it on paper before it happened in reality. She had not prepared for the fact that he would already be watching her when she walked in. Not the way men sometimes watched women enter rooms, the lazy, proprietary scan. He was watching the way she imagined he watched the photograph on the camera, measuring, precise, like he was counting something behind her face that she didn't know was visible. She almost stopped walking, caught herself, kept going. He stood when she reached the table, which was unexpected, old-fashioned in a way that felt neither performative nor ironic, just something he did because it was the thing to do, filed under a personal category of minimum standards that had nothing to do with impressing anyone. He was taller than the photograph suggested. The suit was dark, no tie, the collar open one button. He looked like a man who had never once in his life dressed to please someone else. "Maribel Quinn," he said. Not a question. "That's me," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. He pulled out her chair. She sat. He sat across from her. There was a beat of silence while the server materialized to pour water and vanish again, and in that beat Cassian Vale looked at her the way she imagined surgeons look at x-rays, not unkindly, just with the understanding that the surface was not the point. "You took the bus," he said. She went still. "Excuse me?" "Crosstown bus. Got off on Hargrove and walked from there." He picked up his water glass. "I had a car available if you'd needed one." She hadn't told anyone she was taking the bus. She'd told her father she'd get there herself and left it at that. The tightness behind her sternum ratcheted up 2 notches. "I prefer public transit," she said. "In November. In that sweater. I like the cold." He looked at the sweater, at the glasses, at the boots she'd tucked under the table. Then he looked back at her face, and for a moment she had the deeply uncomfortable sensation of being read. Not the performance, not the costume, but the actual text underneath it. "You're not what I expected," he said. Here it was. Good, she thought. Say it. Say she's not what you're looking for. Say there's been some mistake. "No," she said, kept her voice flat, gave him nothing. "No." He set down his water. "I expected you to try less hard." The sentence landed wrong. She replayed it. Try less hard. Not try harder. Not a comment on her appearance being insufficient. A comment on her appearance being deliberate. She felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the November she'd claimed to enjoy. "I don't know what that means," she said. "I think you do." The server returned. There was a brief, formal exchange about the menu. Maribel looked at the first course description, something with microgreens and a foam she couldn't identify, and felt the surreal vertigo of sitting in a 2-Michelin-star restaurant in a moth-eaten sweater, across from a man who had just told her, with absolute tranquility, that he could see through her. She recalibrated. The plan had assumed he would make a snap judgment based on visual information. The plan had not accounted for the possibility that he was the kind of man who looked past visual information as a matter of habit. She needed a new angle. "So you've done your homework," she said. Dropped the pretense of flatness. If the costume wasn't working, she'd try something else, honesty or something shaped like it. "Fine. Yes. I dressed this way on purpose. I was hoping you'd take one look at me and call the whole thing off." She expected something. Offense, maybe? Or the particular cold amusement of a powerful man who'd been underestimated and wanted you to know he found it tedious. Instead, Cassian Vale leaned back in his chair with the unhurried ease of someone who'd just had a question answered that he'd been sitting with for a while. "There it is," he said. "There what is. The thing behind the glasses." He wasn't smiling. It wasn't a smile exactly. It was more like the expression of a man whose working theory had been confirmed. "You're not passive, are you? The rags weren't about giving up. They were strategy. They were supposed to make you go away." "I'm still here." "I noticed." The first course arrived. She looked at her plate. He looked at her. The candlelight between them was the only soft thing in the conversation. "Why?" she asked after a moment. She meant it as a genuine question, stripped of strategy. She genuinely did not understand why a man with his resources and his reputation and his apparent ability to see through surfaces would not have simply stood up, thanked her for her time, and walked out. Any rational calculation favored that outcome. She had engineered specifically for that outcome. "Why are you still sitting here?" "Because the last 4 women I met in situations like this," he said, "spent the entire first course trying to impress me. One of them practiced her laugh for 2 weeks. I know because her sister mentioned it." He picked up his fork. "You walked in wearing that on purpose, knowing who I was and what this meeting meant, and you sat down anyway. That's the most honest thing I've seen at a table like this in years. I sat down because I thought you'd leave within 10 minutes. You sat down," he said, "because you don't run, even when running would be easier." She didn't have an answer for that. She sat with it, the way you sit with something that is accurate in a way you didn't invite. Across the restaurant, a woman at the next table was watching them. Had been, Maribel realized, since she sat down. The woman was the kind of beautiful that announced itself. Structured, expensive, maintained with the precision of a public asset. She had the look of someone who knew Cassian Vale, or wanted to, and was performing the calculation of Maribel's presence with visible distaste. Maribel had clocked her the moment she sat down, had filed her, and moved on. The woman made a comment to her companion, low-voiced, designed to carry just far enough. Something about the help getting the wrong address. The table near them heard it. A few people did. There was the particular social silence that follows a cruelty that landed. Maribel had heard worse. She'd heard worse at school when her father's first bankruptcy became public knowledge. She'd heard it in the years since, in the various registers of dismissal that people use on a woman who has lost the social protection of money. She had a whole architecture of response built up for this kind of moment, mostly composed of studied indifference, which she deployed now. The chin slightly up, the gaze fixed forward, the jaw held exactly tight enough to communicate that she'd heard it and had decided it was worth approximately nothing. What she hadn't expected was what happened next. Cassian Vale set down his fork. He turned his head toward the woman's table. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't stand. He simply looked at the woman with the same flat, measuring expression he'd been directing at Maribel since she sat down, and said, in a tone so quiet and so completely without heat that it was somehow more commanding than a shout, apologized to her. The restaurant contracted. It was the only way Maribel could describe it. The way sound seemed to pull inward. The way 3 conversations within earshot stopped between one syllable and the next. The woman who had made the comment went very still in the particular way of someone who has just understood they have made a serious miscalculation. "I'm sorry?" the woman said. A reflex. The kind of faux confusion rich people use to buy time. "You heard me," Cassian said. Same quiet. Same absolute stillness. "You made a comment about the woman sitting across from me. You will apologize to her. Now." A beat of absolute silence. The woman's companion, a gray-suited man of about 50, who had the look of someone accustomed to diffusing situations, touched her arm. She shook it off. Her face had gone through several colors. She landed on a tight, constructed version of graciousness that cost her visibly. "I apologize," she said, in Maribel's direction. "I was rude." Maribel looked at her, held it for 2 seconds. "Fine," she said. Not "thank you," not "it's okay," just "fine," which was neither forgiveness nor prolonged spectacle. The restaurant exhaled. Conversations resumed. The moment passed. Cassian picked up his fork again, ate a piece of whatever the first course was, didn't look at Maribel with any expression that invited comment on what had just happened. She looked at him anyway. "You didn't have to do that." "No," he agreed. "I've handled worse." "I know you have," he said. "That's not why I did it." "Then why?" He looked up from his plate, direct, unhesitating. "Because you're sitting at my table, and no one at my table gets talked to like that. Not by anyone." Maribel was quiet for a moment. Inside, something she'd kept very carefully locked was doing something she hadn't authorized it to do. She focused on her plate, ate a bite of foam and microgreens that tasted surprisingly like something. "That's a territorial response," she said, "not a moral one." "Yes," he said. "You're not going to pretend otherwise." "No." "You're either very honest," she said, "or you're very good at performing honesty. Those aren't mutually exclusive." "No," she said. "They're not." The courses kept coming. The conversation moved in the way conversations move, when 2 people are both trying to hold information back and both aware the other one is doing it. She learned that he had built his first company at 24 and that it had failed, and that he did not appear embarrassed by this in the way people usually perform embarrassment about failure. The careful framing, the valuable learning experience language. He described it flatly, as a thing that happened, a data point in a sequence. She learned that he had no family she could identify from the conversation. No mentions of parents, siblings, anything anchored to a person. Just the empire and the decisions and the forward-moving machine of himself. He learned that she had studied art history, that she'd worked for 2 years at a gallery before her father's second collapse had rearranged her life, that she had a good eye for authentication, that she could look at a painting for 3 minutes and tell you things about it that took other people a spectrograph in a week. She hadn't planned to tell him this. It came out in the context of a question about the painting on the restaurant's far wall, a large abstract piece, technically proficient, emotionally inert, and she'd said it's a good forgery without thinking, and he'd gone very still and said, "You're certain," and she'd described the brush angle and the pigment layering and the specific quality of performed abstraction that forgeries always carried, and he'd looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read, but that felt, for the first time in the evening, like something close to genuine surprise. "You could have kept that to yourself," he said. "I know." "Why didn't you?" She thought about it. The honest answer was that she'd forgotten, for a moment, to be performing anything. The painting had pulled her out of the exercise she'd been running and into the thing she actually cared about, and she hadn't caught herself in time. "Bad habit," she said. "Being interesting?" "Being honest when I should be strategic." He looked at her. "Who told you honesty and strategy were opposites?" She didn't answer that. There was a whole excavation required to answer that properly, and she wasn't doing it at a dinner table with a man she'd come here to escape. The last course was a small thing, elegant, sweet without being cloying. They ate it in a silence that was different from the earlier silences. less tactical, more considered. When the server cleared the plates, Cassian Vale looked at her across the empty table and said, with no particular lead-up, "I'd like to see you again." Maribel had known this was coming, had known somewhere around the third course that the evening had not gone the way she'd engineered it to go, had known that the man across from her was not going to stand up, thank her for her time, and solve her problem by disappearing. She'd known it, and she'd sat with it, and she still didn't have a ready answer for the moment it became explicit. "I'm not—" She stopped, reconstructed. "I came here to make you decide against this arrangement." "I know. The fact that it didn't work doesn't mean I've changed my position." "I understand that," he said. "I'm not asking for your position to change tonight. I'm asking if you'll come to something tomorrow." What kind of something? He told her. It was not, she had to admit, what she would have predicted. Not dinner again. Not a social event. He had a meeting, a logistics meeting, he said, with his senior team, and there was a shipment question that had come up that he wanted a second set of eyes on. The kind of eyes that could look at something and tell the difference between what it appeared to be and what it was. She stared at him. "You want me to come to a business meeting?" "Yes." "Why?" "Because I watched you identify a forged painting in 3 minutes," he said, "and I have a problem that requires exactly that kind of eye. And because," he added, with the particular honesty she was beginning to understand was not a performance at all, but simply his default mode of operation, "it will show you something about the world I operate in before you decide whether it's worth deciding about." It was not a romantic proposition. It was not a pressure tactic. It was, she sat with this for a moment, a genuinely unusual form of respect. The acknowledgement that she needed information to make a decision, and the provision of that information rather than its concealment. She thought about the bus home, about her father's house, where he would be awake when she got back, sitting in the kitchen with his second scotch, waiting to ask how it had gone. She thought about the folder on the kitchen table, and the photograph of the man across from her and the way the photograph had failed, entirely, to capture whatever it was that he actually was. "If I come tomorrow," she said carefully, "it doesn't mean I've agreed to anything." "I know that. I'm not a piece of collateral. I don't care what contract my father signed." "I know that too." "Do you?" She looked at him directly. "Because the entire premise of this arrangement is that I am exactly that, a debt instrument. My father's liability made transferable." Cassian Vale looked back at her with that flat, measuring steadiness. "Your father made an arrangement with me," he said. "You're not party to it. What happens between you and me is separate. You can't actually separate those two things." "Not yet," he said, "but I can." She didn't know what that meant. She filed it, the way she was filing a great many things about this evening. For later, for the longer consideration that came after the performance was done and she was alone with what had actually happened. She said she'd think about it. He didn't push. Just nodded. The way someone nods when "I'll think about it" is exactly the answer they expected, and it's enough. Outside, the night had gotten colder. The car she'd declined was apparently still there. She saw it idling at the curb, a black vehicle of the kind that communicated function over display, a driver who didn't make eye contact. She didn't take the car. She walked the 2 blocks to the bus stop, with her hands in the pockets of the mustard sweater and her breath making small white shapes in the air. She thought about the way he'd said, "You don't run." She thought about the forgery on the wall and the moment she'd forgotten to be strategic. She thought about the woman in the restaurant and Cassian's voice saying apologize to her, not loud, not theatrical, just final. The bus came. She got on, sat near the back again. She didn't go home. She sat on that bus for 40 minutes, past her stop, and through the late-night geography of the city, watching the lights, and somewhere around the third loop she admitted to herself that the plan had failed, not because Cassian Vale had seen through it, but because she had, without meaning to, stopped running it somewhere around the third course. She got off the bus at a corner she didn't recognize and walked for a while in the cold. Somewhere in a glass tower above the skyline, she understood without being able to explain it, a man who had just eaten 18 courses across from a woman in a moth-eaten sweater was sitting with a similar kind of silence. The thought did not comfort her. It frightened her in a way she couldn't fully locate. Not the fear of something bad, but the worse kind. The fear of something that might not be. She pulled out her phone. Her father had texted 3 times. She didn't open the messages. She opened her contacts instead, found the number that had been on the last page of the folder, the one her father had written in his careful, slightly trembling handwriting because his hands weren't steady anymore. She didn't call it. She stood there in the November cold with the phone in her hand and the city making its nighttime sounds around her, and she thought about a man who had seen through $32 worth of deliberate ugliness and smiled, and she thought about what it meant that the smile had not been cruel. Then her phone buzzed. Not a call. A text. From a number she didn't have saved. 4 words. The car is waiting. She looked up. Half a block away, the black vehicle sat at the curb with its lights off, patient as a held breath. Her chest did something complicated. She took 1 step toward it, then stopped. Because at that exact moment, her phone buzzed again. And this time it was not Cassian Vale's number. It was a number she recognized as belonging to her father's lawyer, and the text read, "Call me immediately. Something's happened to the contract." Maribel stood on that corner for 11 seconds. She counted them without meaning to, the way you count things when your brain is buying time for the rest of you to catch up. The lawyer's text sat on her screen. "Call me immediately. Something's happened to the contract." The black car sat half a block away with its engine off and its patience intact. She called the lawyer. He picked up on the first ring, which told her he'd been holding the phone. Gerald Fitch. 60 years old, thin-voiced, had worked for her father since before Maribel was born, which meant he had watched the whole descent with the particular helplessness of someone too embedded to leave and too compromised to intervene. His voice now had the quality of a man who had just seen something he could not unsee and was still deciding what to do with the information. "There's an addendum," he said, without preamble, "to the contract your father signed. I didn't see it until an hour ago. It was attached to the secondary filing and He stopped. Restarted. "Maribel, the addendum transfers your right of refusal." She kept her voice flat. "Say that again." "There's a clause. If you fail to formalize the arrangement within 30 days of the initial meeting, the full debt transfers to you personally, not to your father's estate. To you. Your name. Your credit. Your liability." The cold she'd been standing in changed character. Same temperature, different meaning. "He signed that," she said. Silence. "Gerald?" Her voice came out harder than she intended. "My father signed that addendum." "He signed the full document. I believe he may not have read the secondary pages. Your father has not been—" Another stop. The particular diplomatic pause of a man covering for someone who no longer deserved it. "He's not been reading carefully." She ended the call, stood there. The city moved around her the way cities move at this hour. Taxis, a couple arguing outside a bar 2 doors down, the distant hydraulic exhale of a bus she'd already missed. She thought about her father in the kitchen with his second scotch, thought about the careful diction he'd used when he'd presented the folder. "A man who's agreed to clear our debts. Our." That word doing its own kind of work, folding her into the liability, making her complicit in the architecture of her own sale. She walked to the car. The driver got out before she reached it, didn't speak, opened the rear door. She got in without looking at him. The interior was warm and smelled like nothing, which was its own kind of luxury. The absence of smell, the negative space of expense. There was no partition between her and the driver. No instructions. The car simply began to move. She watched the city through the window and said nothing for 4 blocks. And then she said, "Where are we going?" "Mr. Vale asked that I take you wherever you'd like to go," the driver said. "He said to tell you the offer stands until morning. After that, no pressure." "What offer?" "He didn't specify. He said you'd know." She thought about the text. "The car is waiting. 4 words. Not I want to see you, not come back, just the information." The option existed. What she did with it was hers. She gave the driver her father's address. The house had been losing ground for years. It was a large house, had been an impressive house once, in the way that suburban houses built at the height of someone's financial confidence are impressive. Too many windows, a circular drive, details that had been expensive when new and were now just aging. The gutters needed work. The front garden had the look of something that had been maintained until a specific point and then abandoned, the flowers going to seed, the hedge growing sideways. Maribel had grown up in this house. She no longer thought of it as home. She thought of it as evidence. Her father was in the kitchen, as expected. The scotch was the second, possibly the third. He looked up when she came in, and his face did what faces do when they're holding competing impulses. The relief of her return and the anxiety of what she'd come to say, moving across his features in sequence too fast for him to arrange them into the calm authority he still tried to project. "How did it go?" he said. She put her bag on the counter, looked at him. "You signed an addendum." The competing impulses resolved into something singular and still. "Maribel, the right of refusal transfers to me as personal debt. 30 days. You signed that." He set down the glass. He was 61 years old, and he looked, in this light, about 75. The collapse had done something to his face that the years before it hadn't. "It was a formality," he said. "A guarantee clause. Standard. Don't." The word came out quiet and clean and stopped him mid-sentence. "Don't tell me it's standard. There's nothing standard about putting your daughter's financial future as collateral on a marriage contract. Don't dress it up." He looked at the kitchen table, at the glass, at anything that wasn't her face. "The debts, Maribel. You don't know the full picture. There are people who—" "I know the full picture," she said. "I've known the full picture for 2 years because you stopped knowing it and someone had to. I've watched the accounts. I know who you owe and how much and in what sequence the calls are going to start coming. I've known for 6 months that this house was going to go." She let that land, watched him absorb it. "What I didn't know was that you'd put my name on it." The silence in the kitchen had weight. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a car passed on the residential street. "I didn't think you'd refuse him," her father said, finally. Small voice, the voice of a man who had run out of the larger ones. "I know it's not the way things should be done. But Maribel, the man has resources. He could what, Dad?" She sat down across from him. Not to be near him, to be level with him, to be in the same plane so the conversation couldn't become another performance of authority he no longer had. "Say it clearly. What could he do?" "He could give you a life." She looked at her father for a long moment, looked at the architecture of self-deception required to present it that way. To take "I sold my daughter to erase my mistakes" and render it as "I gave my daughter an opportunity." She had known Orson Quinn her whole life, had loved him in the specific and complicated way you love someone who contains both the person who taught you to read and the person who burned down the structure around you. She did not love him less in this moment. She simply saw him more completely. "Go to bed," she said. "Maribel, I'm not saying that to dismiss you. I'm saying it because you're not in a state to have the rest of this conversation, and neither am I. Go to bed. We'll talk tomorrow." He went. She sat at the kitchen table after she heard the stairs, and she did not pour herself anything, and she did not cry. And she sat with the specific quality of stillness that comes when you have run out of places to put something and must simply hold it in your body until the body adjusts. Her phone screen lit up on the table. A different number this time. One she recognized from the folder because she had memorized everything in the folder. His direct line. Not a text. A call. She picked it up on the third ring. "It's late." "I know," Cassian said. His voice on the phone was the same as in person. No adjustment for the medium, no performed casualness. Just the same flat clarity. "Gerald Fitch called me 40 minutes ago." She went still in a different way. "He called you. He's been on my legal team's contact list since the initial arrangement. He had questions about the addendum. My attorney confirmed the clause was in the document." A pause. "I want you to know I wasn't aware of the right of refusal transfer when I agreed to the original terms. That wasn't something I requested or reviewed." She thought about that, about whether it mattered. "But you would have known eventually." "Yes." "And then what?" "And then we'd be having this conversation under worse conditions," he said. "So I'd rather have it now." She pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum. That pressure again. She'd have to find out what was living there. "The addendum makes my situation significantly worse than yesterday," she said. "Regardless of tonight. If I walk away from this arrangement, the full liability lands on me. My credit, my name, everything I've spent 4 years trying to protect." "Yes. Which means my father has effectively removed my real option, the one where I say no and walk away clean." "Yes." She appreciated that he didn't qualify it, didn't try to soften the shape of it. "So what are you offering?" she said. That's what the text was. An offer. "What is it?" "Come tomorrow," he said. "The meeting I mentioned. Come and see what I'm actually asking you to walk into before you decide anything. Not the arrangement on paper, the actual thing." He paused. "And I'll have my attorneys draft a document that removes the addendum. Whatever happens after, the personal liability clause gets voided. That's not contingent on anything." Maribel sat in the kitchen of her father's failing house with the phone against her ear and looked at nothing in particular. "You'll void it regardless," she said. "Yes." "Why?" "Because it shouldn't exist," he said, "and because I don't negotiate from documents that were signed under false conditions." She thought about the ways that answer could be tactical, the ways that removing her liability could itself be a trap, the warmth of the gesture designed to loosen the very resistance it claimed to respect. She was good at identifying those mechanisms, had spent years learning to read the difference between real and performed. She couldn't find the performance in his voice. That frightened her more than if she had. "I'll come tomorrow," she said, "the meeting, and then I decide." "That's all I'm asking." She hung up, sat for another few minutes, then went to bed and lay in the dark of her childhood room with the sounds of the old house around her, and did not sleep for a long time. He sent the car at 9. She did not wear the sweater. She spent 15 minutes in front of the mirror engaged in a different kind of calculation. Not how to look unwanted, but what to wear as herself, stripped of performance, which turned out to be harder. She put on dark trousers, a white shirt, a blazer that had survived from better years. Plain. Functional. The boots were the same boots. Some things you kept not because they were good, but because they were known. The building was on the north edge of the financial district. 40 stories of dark glass that didn't announce itself with a name or a logo on the outside. Just a street number, which was its own kind of statement. The lobby was the same. Minimal, controlled. The security desk staffed by 2 men who had the posture of people trained for considerably more than checking IDs. They were expecting her. She was taken up in an elevator that moved without sound, and the number it stopped at was 38, which was near the top but not quite, which she noted without knowing yet what it meant. The conference room was already occupied. 6 men. She clocked them in the 2 seconds she had before they clocked her back. Range of ages, 40 to maybe 65. The kind of faces that had been shaped by pressure over time, angular, careful, giving away nothing by default. They were arranged around a long table with the natural hierarchy of men who had sat in this room many times. 2 at the head end close to where Cassian would sit, the others staggered in descending relevance. On the table were documents. A laptop open to a logistics spreadsheet and 3 photographs printed large and placed face up near the center of the table. Cassian was standing near the window when she entered. He looked at her once, a quick, complete assessment that she was learning to recognize as simply how he saw people, not a value judgment, but a data collection, and then said to the room, "This is Maribel Quinn." Nobody welcomed her. Nobody was rude about it. She was simply received with the particular absence of expression that men in rooms like this deploy for anything they haven't yet classified. She felt the assessments moving over her the way you feel a change in air pressure, invisible and physical at once. She sat where Cassian gestured, which was not at the edge of the room, not out of the way. It was at the table, adjacent to him. A man across from her, mid-50s, a square jaw going soft at the edges, the name she'd learn later was Nico Sarven, looked at her with an expression that was not quite contempt, but was adjacent to it, the look of someone who has decided what something is before it speaks. The meeting began. The problem was a shipment. She absorbed the details as they were laid out in the clipped, reference-heavy shorthand of men who had discussed versions of this problem before. A container delivery, rerouted twice, currently sitting in a bonded warehouse outside the port. The manifest listed art and antiques. Insurance documentation valued the contents at $3.4 million. Something in the handling chain had raised a flag. She wasn't told specifically what flag, not yet. And there was a question about whether the contents matched the manifest and what the cost was of getting that wrong in either direction. Destroy it without opening. Lose $3 million if the manifest was accurate. Open and verify. Expose the process to scrutiny if it wasn't. Nico Sarven had an opinion. He delivered it with the confidence of a man used to having opinions absorbed as conclusions. The shipment was probably clean, the flag was probably overzealous. The right call was to move it through before the insurance window closed. 3 of the other men nodded, or gave the head movements adjacent to nodding. The 2 at the head end waited. Cassian said nothing. He turned the 3rd photograph toward Maribel. It was a detail shot. Part of what appeared to be a painting, specifically the lower right quadrant of a large canvas. The shot was taken through the gap in an opened crate, the image slightly washed out by the flash, but the detail was adequate. She could see the edge of the canvas, a section of painted surface, a fragment of the frame. She looked at it, looked for longer than she'd looked at the painting in the restaurant, because this time she had more at stake, or rather understood that something did, and she owed the question her actual attention. The others waited. She was aware of the waiting, aware of Nico Sarven's specific quality of waiting, which was not the patient kind. "The frame is wrong," she said. Sarven made a sound, not quite a laugh, adjacent to one. The frame is machine cut," she said. She kept her voice level, addressed Cassian, not Sarven, because this was information, not a debate. "The molding profile on what you can see here is consistent with mass production. The corner joint is too clean. There's no variation in the decorative channel. That style of frame was designed to replicate 18th century French carving, but the replication process wasn't developed until about 15 years ago, which puts it at least a century out of phase with the period stated on the manifest." She tapped the photograph. "Whatever's in that crate, it either wasn't framed in its original period, or someone reframed it later, which raises its own questions, or this isn't what the manifest says it is." Silence. Sarven said, "You got all that from a flash photograph of a corner?" "Yes." "And you're what, an art dealer?" "No," she said. "I'm someone who can look at a thing and tell you what it actually is." The silence that followed was a different kind from the one before. The 2 men at the head end exchanged something with their eyes that was too quick and too practiced for her to read. Cassian was watching her with the expression she was beginning to catalog as his version of approval. Not warmth, nothing performed, just the expression of a man whose working theory has again been confirmed. He looked at the man on his left. "Hold the shipment. I want a physical inspection before anything moves." Nico Sarven sat back in his chair. He didn't argue, because this was apparently not a room where arguments were made after a final statement, but his body made its position clear, the particular tension of a man who has been overruled and is accounting the debt. His eyes moved to Maribel for a moment, flat and measuring in a way that had nothing to do with Cassian's measuring, and she returned the look without inflection and then looked away, because she had what she needed from that exchange. The meeting broke apart the way these things do, with the efficient dispersal of men who have other rooms to be in. She watched them go and noted the order, the groupings, who spoke to whom on the way out. Sarven left without speaking to anyone. When the room was empty, Cassian said, "You saved me $3 million. "Possibly," she said, "if I'm right about the frame." "You're right about the frame." "You don't know that yet." "I know it," he said, with a certainty that was not arrogance but something more unsettling. The certainty of a man whose read on people had not failed him often enough to generate doubt. "I knew it when you said it. I just needed you in the room to say it." She looked at him across the empty conference table with the city visible through the glass behind him, 40 stories of nothing between them and the sky. "What does that mean for the arrangement?" she said. "Practically. What are you actually asking?" He came around the table, sat in the chair that had been Sarven's, which put him close enough that she could read the texture of the decision in his face. "I'm asking you to work with me," he said. "Not as a wife in the decorative sense, not as a name on a contract. I have a problem that requires the kind of eye you have, and the kind of nerve you showed last night. There are people in my organization who need to understand that I'm not operating the same way I was 3 years ago, that things are changing, and I'm—" She stopped, tried again. "You want me visible, as a signal." "As a fact," he said. "Not a signal. A fact." She sat with that. "The people in that room," she said carefully, "not all of them are comfortable with change." "No." "Sarven." A pause. Short. "He's been with me 11 years. That's not an answer." "No," he said. It's not. She looked at him directly. If I do this, if I agree to any version of this, I need to know what I'm walking into, not the arrangement on paper, the actual thing, the version where things go wrong. Cassian Vale looked back at her with those flat, measuring eyes that had seen through $32 worth of deliberate ugliness and had not apparently stopped looking since. The version where things go wrong, he said, is the only version I can guarantee you'll need to be ready for. She opened her mouth to respond. The door opened. One of the men from the head end, the older one, gray-suited, whose name she hadn't gotten, leaned in with an expression that had collapsed into something she recognized even without knowing this world. The face of a person delivering news that cannot be held. The gray-suited man's name was Dressler. She learned that in the next 4 seconds, because Cassian said it, Dressler, in the tone of a man who uses a single word to mean this had better be worth interrupting, and Dressler absorbed that tone with the practiced neutrality of someone who had been absorbing it for years, and came in anyway because the alternative was worse. The warehouse, Dressler said. There's been a development. Cassian stood. The movement was immediate. No transition between sitting and standing, the kind of physical response that lived below conscious decision. How bad? Someone called the Port Authority. Anonymous tip. They're requesting access within the hour. The room changed temperature without changing temperature. Maribel felt it the way you feel a shift in a building when something structural moves. Not visible, not loud, just a sudden awareness that the ground is not entirely what it was a moment ago. Cassian looked at her. 1 second, no longer. Then back to Dressler. Who had access to the shipment details? This room, Dressler said, and the warehouse manager. That's the full list. The warehouse manager has been with us 8 years. Yes. And the people in this room. Cassian's voice had not changed in volume or temperature. It had changed in something harder to name, a quality of compression, the way pressure changes air without moving it. Who left this room in the last 20 minutes? Dressler's eyes moved, briefly and involuntarily, and that movement was its own answer before he said anything. They moved toward the door, toward the direction Nico Sarvin had walked when he left without speaking to anyone. Cassian saw it. Of course he saw it. He saw everything. He didn't react. That was the thing that settled into Maribel's chest with a particular weight. He didn't react, because the reaction was already done somewhere internal, and what remained on the surface was just the machinery of what came next. Get the shipment moved, he said to Dressler. Different location. Do it now before the hour's up, and find me Sarvin. Dressler left. Cassian stood at the window for a moment with his back to her, looking at the city, and she watched the line of his shoulders and understood that she was seeing something very few people were permitted to see. Not a breakdown, nothing that dramatic, just the 3 seconds between receiving information and deciding what it meant, the human interval before the machine reassembled. Then he turned around, and he was the same man he'd been before. I need to make calls, he said. I'll have someone take you. I'll wait, she said. He looked at her. If this is what you're actually asking me to walk into, she said, I should see what it looks like when it goes wrong. You said that yourself. A pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. It could take a while. I'll wait, she said again. He nodded. Made the calls. Chud. It took 2 hours. She sat in the conference room while the building operated around her. Footsteps in corridors. Voices she couldn't make out through walls. The controlled urgency of a large organization managing a problem. Someone brought her coffee at some point. She didn't ask who. She drank it and looked at the city through the glass and thought about frame joints and manifest values and the specific expression on Nico Sarvin's face when she'd said the frame is wrong. The expression of a man accounting a debt. She had filed that at the time. She retrieved it now. Cassian came back at 11:30. He sat down across from her, not at the head of the table this time, but adjacent, and he looked tired in the way that competent people look tired. Not collapsed, just running on a slightly thinner margin than an hour ago. The shipment's been moved, he said. Port Authority found an empty warehouse. There'll be paperwork, questions, a few days of administrative friction, nothing that can't be managed. And Sarvin? He looked at her for a moment. Something moved behind his face that she didn't have full vocabulary for yet. Not answering his phone, he said. What was in the shipment, she said. The real contents. He was quiet for a moment, deciding something. She watched him decide it and waited, because she understood that this was a threshold, that what he said next would either include her or exclude her, and that the inclusion would carry its own weight. Stolen works, he said. Pre-war European, 14 pieces. They'd passed through 6 different ownership chains in the last 40 years, each chain documented well enough to create the appearance of legitimacy. The manifest value was accurate, possibly conservative. The problem wasn't the value. The problem was 2 of the pieces have provenance flags in an international database that my team wasn't aware of when the shipment was accepted. Wasn't aware, she said carefully, or was told they didn't exist. The pause was a fraction of a second. That's the question I'm currently sitting with, he said. She thought about this, about the shape of it. Sarvin, 11 years in the organization, leaving the meeting without speaking to anyone. An anonymous tip called to the port authority within minutes of the meeting ending. The shipment he'd wanted moved through without inspection. The provenance flags nobody had flagged. He wasn't trying to destroy the shipment, she said slowly. He was trying to move it through before anyone could look at it. The anonymous tip came after I identified the problem. He called the port authority to force your hand. Make you choose between exposure and losing the whole thing. She looked at Cassian. If you'd moved it through fast like he recommended, it would have gone somewhere he controlled, not you. Cassian looked at her with an expression that had gone very still. He's been running a secondary channel, she said. It wasn't a question anymore. The shape of it was too clean. That's not the first shipment. That's just the first one that got looked at correctly. No, Cassian said, quiet as a door closing. It's not the first one. What? He took her to a different floor. Down, not up. A level below the conference rooms, accessed by a separate elevator that required a key card she didn't have, and he did. The room it opened into was smaller, no windows, lit by overhead panels, and it contained 3 things: a long table, a laptop, and a man she hadn't seen in the meeting upstairs. The man's name was Colum. He was maybe 35, slight, the kind of face that was easy to not look at, which she suspected was deliberate and professional. He had the laptop open to a spreadsheet that, even from across the room, carried the dense numerical texture of financial records. Tell her what you told me, Cassian said. Colum looked at Maribel with a brief calibrating assessment, then looked at Cassian, and Cassian gave him something with a look that apparently constituted clearance, because Colum turned back to the screen. 17 shipments over 31 months, he said. His voice was flat, technical, the voice of a man who had learned to deliver bad information without the delivery becoming the thing people reacted to. All routed through the same 3 logistics contacts, all manifested as art and antiques, aggregate declared value, 41 million. We estimate actual value significantly higher. Some of the pieces we've identified through partial documentation carry individual valuations in the 7-figure range. He paused. The secondary channel routes to a holding company registered in a jurisdiction that doesn't share disclosure agreements with domestic regulatory bodies. The holding company has 1 beneficial owner. Sarvin, Maribel said. The ownership is layered, Colum said. But yes, when you strip back the layers, it's Sarvin. She looked at Cassian. He was standing with his arms crossed, looking at the spreadsheet, and his face had the quality she was learning to read as the expression of a man who has just confirmed something he had begun to suspect and did not want to be right about. 11 years, she said. Yes. How long have you suspected? A muscle moved in his jaw. Long enough that I should have moved faster, he said. There were inconsistencies, small ones. I attributed them to operational variance. A pause. I trusted the relationship over the data. It was a harder admission than it sounded. She understood that. The particular self-accounting of a man who had built his entire operation on the precision of his own judgment and had just found a place where the judgment had bent. What happens now? She said. Now I find him, Cassian said. The simplicity of it was its own kind of cold. She thought about asking what finding him meant in this specific operational context. She decided she had enough information to construct the answer and did not need it confirmed. There's something else, Colum said. Both of them looked at him. He had the expression of a man who had been carrying the second piece of information since before they came in and had been waiting for the right moment, or possibly just waiting for the courage to deliver it, and had decided this was as good as it was going to get. The provenance database flags, he said. The two pieces with documented ownership claims. I ran the claimant names this morning. He looked at his screen. One of them is a federal case. Open investigation. Art Crimes Unit, 18 months in. He looked up. The case file lists the shipment's last known location as this city. The investigator attached to the file has been running surveillance on 3 logistics companies for the past 4 months. The silence that followed had a specific texture. Maribel felt it settle over the room the way fog settles. Gradual, total, changing the way everything looked without moving anything. They're already here, she said. They've been here, Cullum said. The surveillance started before the shipment was moved the first time, which means they didn't follow the shipment, Cassian said. His voice was absolutely level. Someone told them where to look. Cullum said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the silence wasn't already saying. Maribel's mind was moving fast in the way it moved when she was in front of a painting she needed to read. Gathering detail, sequencing it, building the structure backward from what was visible to what had to be true beneath. Sarvin had been running a secondary channel for 31 months. The federal surveillance had started 4 months ago. The gap between those two numbers was not an accident. He's not just stealing from you, she said. He's been talking to them. Cassian turned and looked at her with the full force of his attention, which was a considerable thing to have directed at you in a small room. Sarvin's been managing both sides, she said. Moving product through your infrastructure, keeping the federal investigation pointed just close enough to create pressure, but not close enough to close the case. He wants the investigation to damage you without landing on him. She looked at the spreadsheet, at the 31 months of it. The tip to the Port Authority this morning wasn't just about the shipment, it was about me. I identified the frame. He understood that meant the shipment was going to be examined, which meant the provenance flags would surface, which meant the federal connection would surface. He needed to move faster. He panicked, Cassian said. He recalculated, she said. There's a difference. Panic would be running. He called the Port Authority. He's still managing the situation. He thinks he can still control where this lands. Cassian looked at her for a long moment. In the flat overhead light of this windowless room, with the weight of 31 months of betrayal sitting on the table between them, he looked like something that had been tested and had not broken, but had been permanently altered by the pressure. You should go home, he said. No. Maribel. The first time he'd used her name without a last name, she registered it without allowing it to change anything. This is past the point where, my name is on your father's lawyer's paperwork, she said, and the words came out harder and faster than she'd planned. The addendum your attorney is voiding? It's not voided yet. It's still a document that exists. If the federal investigation surfaces and your name is on it, and my name is adjacent to yours through a marriage contract, even an unsigned one, I become part of the blast radius whether I walk out this door or not. She held his eyes. I'm already in this. I was put in this before I knew what this was. So stop trying to manage my exposure and let me help you manage the actual problem. The room was very quiet. Cullum was looking at his laptop with the focused attention of a man who has decided that whatever was happening 3 feet to his left was not his to witness. Cassian looked at her for a long time. She held it, did not look away, did not soften it, because she had nothing left to perform and no reason to perform it. All right, he said. They went back to the conference room. The city had moved into afternoon outside the glass, the light shifting from morning white to the flatter gray of November midday. Cassian made more calls. She listened to the ones he made in the room and built her picture of the organization from the shape of his questions. Who he trusted in what sequence, which names he said, and which he withheld, where the real architecture of loyalty lived as distinct from the formal one. She asked questions when she had them. He answered. Not everything. There were pauses that meant not yet, and she respected them. But enough. More than she had expected. At one point he put the phone down and looked at her across the table and said, You're not what I expected. You said that last night, she said, in the restaurant. I meant something different then, he said. I meant the rags and the glasses, the performance. He looked at her steadily. This time, I mean the rest of it. She didn't ask what the rest of it meant. She thought she knew, and knowing was enough without the confirmation. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Her father. She let it go to voicemail. Then felt the guilt of that, the specific guilt that had no clean answer. She would have to talk to him, would have to have the conversation she'd been putting off since the kitchen last night. But not now. Not while she was in the middle of trying to understand the size of what she'd walked into. It buzzed again. Voicemail again. The third time it rang, she answered, because 3 calls in a row meant something other than routine anxiety. "Dad, there's a man here." His voice had a quality she hadn't heard since the second bankruptcy. The voice of someone trying to maintain the register of competence while the floor was actively leaving. "He came to the house. He says he's a federal investigator." Everything in the room went silent for her in a way that had nothing to do with actual sound. "Did you let him in?" she said, kept her voice flat, looked at Cassian, who was already watching her face. "He said it wasn't optional," her father said. "Maribel, he had paperwork. He asked about the veil arrangement. He asked about the contract." A pause that contained multitudes. "He asked about you." She held the phone against her ear and looked at Cassian and watched his face do what it did when he was processing. That absolute stillness, that interior calculation running behind eyes that gave nothing away. And she thought about Sarvin recalculating, still managing the situation, deciding where to aim the damage. She thought about her name on a document. She thought about 31 months and 17 shipments in a federal case that had been running for 18 months and had just, in the space of one morning, one meeting, one comment about a picture frame, found a new angle to work. "Don't say anything," she told her father. "Not one word. I'm on my way." She hung up. Cassian was already standing. "Sarvin didn't just call the Port Authority," she said, and her voice surprised her with its steadiness, because inside she was running a very different calculation. "He gave them my father's address. He pointed them at the contract." She picked up her bag. "He's trying to use me as—" She was already moving toward the door when Cassian's hand closed around her arm. Not hard, just enough to stop the momentum. "Not like that," he said. "My father—" "Your father is fine. A federal investigator asking questions at a residential address is a pressure tactic, not an arrest. They're fishing." His grip loosened but didn't release. "If you walk in there reactive, you hand them the reaction. That's what Sarvin wants. He wants you scared and moving fast and saying things you can't take back." She stopped, breathed. He was right, and she hated that he was right, because the alternative, the image of her father in that kitchen with his third scotch and a federal investigator sitting across from him asking about contracts and arrangements, was pulling hard at everything calm she had left. "Then what?" she said. "We go together," he said. "My attorney meets us there in 20 minutes. Nobody says a word until she arrives." He let go of her arm. "And on the way, you tell me everything Sarvin knows about you. Everything. Not what you think matters. Everything." The car moved through the midday city with the kind of velocity that money made possible. Not speeding, nothing visible, just the particular efficiency of a driver who knew which lanes opened and when, who had driven the city long enough to read it like a living map. Maribel sat in the back with Cassian and talked. She told him about the gallery, the 2 years she'd worked authentication, the clients she'd dealt with, the pieces she'd handled. She told him about the moment her father's second collapse had pulled the floor out. The call from the gallery director, professionally warm, professionally final, the kind of conversation designed to feel like a mutual decision when it was nothing of the sort. She told him about the years since, the consulting work, the smaller galleries, the slow, careful reconstruction of a professional identity on a budget that left no margin for error. She told him about the folder, about the photograph, about the $32 sweater, and what she'd intended it to accomplish. He listened without interrupting. She had the sense he was filing it all, not passively, but actively building something from the information, a structure she couldn't fully see yet. "Sarvin was in the meeting when you identified the frame," he said when she'd finished. "Yes." "He heard everything you said. He knows what you can do." "Yes." "Which means he understands that if you stay in my orbit, you become a permanent problem for him." He looked at her. "This isn't just about the contract. He's pointing the federal investigation at you because you're the variable he can't predict. He needs you gone before you look at anything else." She thought about that, about the 17 shipments. about the picture she'd been building from partial information all morning and what it looked like now with this piece added. "There's more in those shipments," she said. "He knows I'd find it." "Yes." "How much more?" Cassian looked at the city through the window for a moment. "Enough that if it surfaces in the wrong context, it doesn't just take him down," he said. "It takes down everyone adjacent, including me." She sat with that. "So he needs to move fast," she said. "He's already moving," Cassian said. "The Port Authority call, your father's address. That's not the end of it. That's the opening." He turned back to her. "Sarvin's been running this for 31 months. He's careful. He doesn't improvise unless he has to. The fact that he's improvising now means he's scared. And scared men with resources are the most dangerous kind." The car stopped outside her father's house. The investigator's name was Harlan Voss. Late 40s, the build of a man who'd been athletic once and had let it settle into something denser and more stationary, the kind of face that had been arranged into professional neutrality for so long it had calcified there. He was sitting in the kitchen, her father's kitchen, at her father's table, with a notepad and a paper cup of coffee that her father had apparently made him, because Orson Quinn could not stop performing hospitality, even when hospitality was the last thing the situation called for. He stood when they came in, looked at Maribel, then at Cassian, then did the calculation that law enforcement did when they saw the two things they were investigating walk through the same door. "Mr. Vale," he said. "Mr. Voss," Cassian said. His tone was the same as it always was, unaffected, not aggressive, not cooperative, just present. "I think you know my attorney." The woman who came in behind them was named Clara Race. 50, compact, the kind of woman who wore dark colors because they didn't distract from her eyes, which were the eyes of someone who had spent 30 years reading the space between what people said and what they meant. She set her bag on the counter without asking permission and looked at Voss with the expression of a person who has encountered this specific configuration of situation many times and found it manageable. "My clients won't be answering questions today," Claire said. "If you have something formal, you know where to send it." Voss looked at her, then at Cassian, then at Maribel. He had the look of a man who had come here expecting a particular kind of conversation and was recalibrating. "Miss Quinn," he said, addressing her directly. "I'm not here about Mr. Vale. I'm here about a contract registered under your father's name that lists you as a principal party. That makes you relevant to a separate inquiry." "Relevant in what sense?" Clara said. "The contract was notarized and filed with a document processing service that we've been watching for 14 months, Voss said. He looked at Maribel, not Clara. The same service processed paperwork for several shell entities connected to a cultural property investigation. Maribel kept her face still. She was aware of her father at the far end of the kitchen, standing near the refrigerator with his arms at his sides, and the look of a man watching something he set in motion arrive at its destination. "My client's name on a contract processed by a service you're investigating," Clara said, "doesn't make my client part of your investigation. It makes her adjacent to your paperwork." "It makes her a potential witness," Voss said. "At minimum." "Then you'll do this formally." Clara picked up her bag. "Send the request. We'll respond appropriately." Voss looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Cassian, and the look was the specific look of a law enforcement officer communicating to a subject that this conversation was not over, merely adjourned. "We know about the shipment," he said. "Simple, clean. A card placed on the table face up." The room did not change. Nobody moved. Claire's expression did not alter. Cassian looked at Voss with the same flat steadiness he brought to everything. "Then you know it's been moved to a secure location pending a private provenance review," Cassian said, "which is standard procedure for art of uncertain origin. My team identified a potential documentation issue and is addressing it internally. If your investigation intersects with that process, my attorney will be in touch." Voss looked at him for a long moment. Something moved behind his face. The assessment of a man deciding whether to push or hold. He held. "I'll be in touch," he said to Clara. He picked up his paper cup, looked at Maribel one more time with the particular attention of someone filing a face. Then he left. The kitchen exhaled. Her father made a sound that was not quite a word. "Don't," Maribel said, without looking at him. Clara left 30 minutes later with instructions, counter-instructions, and the specific focused energy of a woman who had a great deal of phone calls to make. Cassian stayed. Her father drifted out of the kitchen with the look of a man who understood he was not wanted in the conversation that was coming and had enough self-awareness left to remove himself from it without being asked. She and Cassian stood in the kitchen in the quiet. Sarvin gave Voss the document processing angle, she said. He knew about the notarization service. Yes. Which means he used the same service deliberately. Set it up so any inquiry into the shipments could be redirected toward the contract. Toward me. She looked at him. He's been building this for a while. This isn't improvisation. He had a contingency. I know, Cassian said. The two words carried the specific weight of a man who has understood something about a person he trusted and is now living in the aftermath of that understanding. Where is he? She said. Working on it. Cassian, she said his name the way she said things when she was done managing her register. Where is he, Buzz? He looked at her. There's a place he uses, he said carefully, a club he owns under a separate name, Meridian, South Waterfront. He uses it when he needs to be visible without being findable, the kind of public that makes it hard to approach him directly. She thought about that, about Sarvin in a nightclub on the South Waterfront, being visible, surrounded by people, constructing a version of normal, while the federal investigation moved and Cassian's organization absorbed the damage, and her name sat on a document connected to a paper trail that Sarvin had built to redirect exactly this kind of heat. He's waiting, she said. She does. He's waiting for me to come to him angry and visible, Cassian said. That's the move. He's been managing two sides of this for 31 months. He knows how I respond. He thinks I'll come in force and give him footage, witnesses, an incident, something he can hand to Voss. So you can't go in force, she said. No. But he needs to be drawn out. She looked at her hands on the counter. He needs to see something that makes him move, something that breaks the calculation. Yes. She looked up. He's scared of me, she said. Not of you. He's been dealing with you for 11 years and he has a whole architecture of response built for what you do. I'm the new variable. I'm the one who looked at the photograph and found the frame. She held his eyes. He doesn't know how to predict me, which means I'm the one who can make him panic. Cassian went very still. No, he said. It's the right move. You're not... He stopped. Something tightened in his face. You're not trained for this. This isn't a painting on a wall. Sarvin is not a man who responds well to being cornered. I know that, she said. I'm not trying to corner him. I'm trying to make him run. There's a difference. She held his gaze. You said I don't run. That was the first thing you saw in me. Well, Sarvin runs when he recalculates. We need to give him a calculation he can't manage. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the November sky had gone flat and gray, the light pressing down on the failing garden, and the gutters that needed fixing, and the whole accumulated evidence of a life that had not gone where it was supposed to go. Cassian looked at her for a long time. The machinery behind his eyes was running. She could feel it. The same assessment he'd run the moment she walked into the restaurant. The same measurement, except now there was more data, and the picture it was building was different. You walk in with me, he said finally. Visible. Together. Not hiding. Yes. He sees us coming and he understands that the contingency he built didn't work. That you're still there, still looking. Yes. And when he runs, Cassian said, he runs to wherever he's keeping the documentation, the real records. The 31 months of it. Which is what you need, she said. Not him. The records. The full picture. He looked at her. If anything goes wrong... Things are already wrong, she said. They were wrong before I walked into that restaurant. I'm choosing to be in this. That's different from being put in it. Meridian occupied this ground floor of a converted warehouse on the South Waterfront, the kind of building that had been industrial and was now expensive in the way that former industrial spaces were expensive. Raw surfaces, deliberate roughness, the aesthetic of authenticity purchased at significant cost. The line outside was 40 people deep at 9 in the evening, which was early for a place like this, and the line meant nothing to the black car that stopped at the side entrance. She wore the red dress. She hadn't planned the red dress. It had been in a garment bag in the back of the car. She didn't ask how, didn't ask who had thought of it or when. She'd looked at it for a moment and then put it on in the back seat with the privacy screen up, which was an experience she would file somewhere under things this week has required of me and not examine further. It fit. It was the deep red of something that had made a decision. Over it she wore his black leather jacket, which he'd handed to her without comment, and which was too large and which she wore anyway. She looked, she knew, nothing like the woman who had walked into Evander in a mustard sweater. She looked like someone who had decided. Cassian walked beside her, not ahead, not protective adjacent. Beside. Equal pace. The side door opened before they reached it. Someone inside who was watching for them. And then they were in the noise and the heat and the compressed atmosphere of a room full of people who didn't know that the night had a different center than they understood. She scanned the room the way she'd been taught to scan a gallery, systematically, without letting the eye get pulled by what was loudest. Bar, left. Tables elevated on a platform, right. Dance floor center. VIP section in the back behind a rope that was more symbolic than functional. She found Sarvin in 11 seconds. He was at the VIP table. 3 other men with him, the body language of a casual gathering that was anything but. He had a glass in his hand and his phone on the table and the specific quality of stillness of someone who is performing relaxation over a substrate of high alert. He saw them at the same moment she found him. She watched it happen. The glass in his hand, the slight freeze, the recalculation beginning. She could see it the way she could see the difference between a real brushstroke and a replicated one. The specific quality of something that was almost right but wasn't. He hadn't expected her. He'd expected Cassian, possibly, had a response architecture built for Cassian, but not this. Not her in a red dress and a leather jacket walking through his club like she owned the floor. She kept walking. Didn't look away from him. Let him see that she saw him. Let him understand that the variable he'd been trying to eliminate was standing 30 feet away and moving closer. His hand moved to his phone, Cassian said very quietly, beside her. He's going to run. I know, she said. When he runs... I know, she said again. Go. Sarvin stood, said something to the men at his table, moved toward the back of the club, not fast, still managing the appearance of casual, but moving with the directional intention of a man who has identified an exit. Cassian peeled left. She kept going straight, not following Sarvin, but visible, central, the thing in the room that couldn't be unfiled. She reached the VIP rope and stopped and looked at the men at Sarvin's table and let them look back at her and understood from their faces that they knew who she was, or had just figured it out, and that the information was moving through the room's informal network the way information moved in rooms like this. Her phone buzzed. Cassian. He's heading for the dock exit. I have 2 men outside. Don't follow. She stayed. Stood in the noise and the heat of the club with his leather jacket over a red dress that had made a decision, and she waited, and she breathed, and she felt her heart doing what hearts do when they've accepted that the situation is past the point of management and the only thing left is to be steady inside it. Then she heard it. From outside, from the direction of the waterfront. Not a shot, nothing that cinematic. Just a sound, truncated and hard. The specific acoustic signature of a situation that has passed the threshold of the manageable and become something else. Then Cassian's name in her mouth and her feet already moving toward, she pushed through the club's back door before she'd finished deciding to. The waterfront hit her like a physical thing. Cold, salt thick, the smell of diesel and standing water and the particular organic rot of a working dock that never fully dried. The door swung shut behind her and cut the music to nothing, and she was standing on a narrow service walkway with the black water of the harbor 30 feet below and the maze of shipping containers spreading out ahead of her under dock lights that turned everything the color of old bone. She heard voices, not words. The shape of voices, 2 of them, then a third, then a sound that was not a voice. She ran toward it. The containers were arranged in irregular rows, some stacked too high, some single, the alleys between them varying from wide enough for a vehicle to narrow enough that she had to turn sideways. She moved fast and without a plan, which she understood was the wrong approach, and did anyway, because the alternative was standing still. Her boots were wrong for this. The red dress was wrong for this. None of it mattered. She found them in an open space between 4 container stacks, a rough square of dock, maybe 40 feet across, lit by a single elevated light that cast long shadows and made everything look like the inside of something. Three of Cassian's men she didn't know by name: Sarvin and Cassian. Sarvin had not run cleanly. He'd run into the containment, which was what Cassian had intended, and the containment had not gone cleanly either, because Sarvin had arrived at this situation with more preparation than they'd accounted for. There was a man down, one of Cassian's three, on his knee, hand pressed to his side with the specific concentration of someone managing pain and doing it consciously. Sarvin had something in his hand that was not a gun, but was close enough in the low light to make the geometry of the space very specific. A blade. Long. The kind of thing a man carries when he spent 11 years in rooms where carrying it was never necessary, and has recently revised that assessment. Cassian was standing 8 feet from him. No weapon visible, just standing, the way he stood at windows and at tables, with his whole weight settled and nothing borrowed from the situation to stay upright. Sarvin's face, when Maribel saw it, was not the face she'd catalogued at the conference table. That face had been controlled, calibrated, the professional surface of a man managing multiple concurrent narratives. This face was something underneath that surface, stripped of the management. It was the face of a man who had spent 31 months building a structure and had watched it come apart in less than 12 hours, and was now doing the last and most dangerous thing. The thing people do when the structure is gone and there's nothing left to protect except the body and the fact of still being in the room. He saw her. The blade in his hand adjusted. Not toward her, just acknowledged her existence in the geometry. Recalculated. "You," he said. The word came out stripped of everything except its own weight. She stopped. Stood still. Her breathing was louder than she wanted it to be. The cold off the water was getting into everything. Her hands, her neck, the exposed skin between the jacket's collar and her jaw. "Me," she said. "You've been here one day?" Sarvin said. His voice had the tight, over-precise quality of someone holding something together with conscious effort. "One day. And you burned 11 years. She didn't answer that. "I built this," he said. "Half of what he has, I built. The logistics chain, the documentation network, the relationships with the overseas buyers. I built the infrastructure he runs everything through." The blade didn't move, but his hand did, slightly, the tendons in his forearm shifting. And he brings in a girl in a thrift store sweater, and she looks at a photograph for 3 minutes, and suddenly I'm standing on a dock. "You built the secondary channel too," she said, kept her voice level, kept her eyes on his face, not the blade. "You built that longer, 31 months. That's the thing you actually spent time on." Something crossed his face, not guilt, more complex than guilt. The expression of a man who has been carrying a private justification for a long time, and is now in a situation where the justification has nowhere to go. "He was getting soft," Sarvin said. 3 years ago, he started talking about restructuring, new rules, different operations. I watched him pull back from things that made us functional and replace them with—" He stopped. "With principles. As if this business runs on principles." "So you built an exit," Cassian said. His voice was even, not cold, not heated, just steady. The way it was always steady. "Using my infrastructure, my contacts, my trust." Sarvin looked at him. The look between them carried 11 years of shared history and this present moment, and nothing in between was adequate to bridge those two things. "Yes," Sarvin said. Simple. The word of a man who had decided that at least this would be honest. The man on his knee made a sound, not loud, controlled pain, adjusting his position. Cassian's eyes went to him for half a second, then back to Sarvin. "Put it down," Cassian said. "And then what?" "And then we finished this conversation without someone losing a hand." Sarvin's jaw moved. He was doing the last calculation. She could see it, the same way she could see the sequence in a painting, the decisions made before the final layer. He was calculating whether the blade changed the math, whether there was a version of this moment that ended somewhere other than where it was clearly going to end. He was finding, she understood, that there wasn't. The structure was gone. The contingency had failed. Voss hadn't moved fast enough. She was still standing in the room. The blade came down. Not dropped. Set down, deliberately, on the top of the nearest container, the gesture of a man who was not surrendering but was acknowledging the specific arithmetic of the moment. Cassian nodded to his two standing men. They moved. She looked away. It took another hour to clear the dock. She spent most of it sitting on a bollard near the water's edge with Cassian's jacket still on and the red dress doing nothing against the cold and the harbor making its slow, indifferent sounds around her. Someone brought her a thermal blanket at some point. She didn't see who, and she put it over her shoulders and sat with it and let herself be cold and present and not managing anything for a few minutes. The man who'd been hurt was named Teller. She learned this because Cassian told her, coming to sit beside her while his people worked, his voice carrying the specific weight of a man accounting his costs. Teller was going to be fine. The wound was deep but not critical, the kind of injury that would leave a scar and a story and a long recovery and would not, in the final accounting, take anything permanent. She nodded. "You shouldn't have come out here," Cassian said. "I know." "You could have." "I know," she said. "I did it anyway." He was quiet. Beside her, not close, just present in the same way he was always present, fully, without performance. "The documentation," she said after a moment. "Sarvin's records, the 31 months. Colum is pulling it now," he said. The secondary channel was routed through 3 servers. 2 of them were accessible from his phone once we had the phone. A pause. "It's extensive. It'll take time to work through, but it's there. Enough to manage Voss. Enough to give Voss what he actually wants," Cassian said. "The overseas buyers, the cultural property chain, the full network." He looked at the water. "Sarvin thought he was building leverage against me. He was building a complete picture of an operation I had no idea existed under my infrastructure. Voss gets that picture. He closes his case. What he doesn't get is anything that touches our core operations. Because Sarvin kept the channels clean, he needed plausible deniability in both directions." She thought about that, about the specific irony of it. Sarvin's careful separation of his channel from Cassian's operations, designed to protect his exit, now functioning to limit the blast radius. "Your attorney is going to be busy," she said. "She's already busy," he said, something in his voice that was not quite a smile. "She's been busy since this morning." Maribel looked at the water. The harbor at this hour was dark except for the dock lights and the distant navigation markers, red and green, blinking in their patient sequence. She thought about all the things that had happened since last night. The restaurant, the bus, the kitchen, her father's voice on the phone, the conference room, Colum's spreadsheet, the club, and the red dress, and the sound from outside the door that had sent her running. Less than 24 hours. She felt the weight of it in her body the way you feel a long day in your joints. Not dramatic, not collapsed, just present, accumulated. "What happens to my father's debt?" she said. Cassian was quiet for a moment. "It was always going to be resolved," he said. "That was never contingent on tonight or on anything you did." "That's not what I asked." "The debt is cleared," he said. "Has been, since the arrangement was formalized. The addendum is being voided. Your father owes nothing. The house stays." She sat with that. Tried to feel what she expected to feel. Relief, maybe. The clean resolution of the problem she'd been carrying since the folder appeared on the kitchen table. What she actually felt was more complicated. The debt being gone did not undo the fact of it having been created. Did not change the folder, the photograph, the morning her father had put the orange juice and the toast beside the evidence of what he'd done. "He put my name on a debt instrument," she said. "Not to Cassian, just to the water and the cold." "Yes," Cassian said. "He didn't qualify it. I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to know yet," he said. She looked at him. He was looking at the water, his profile against the dock lights, and he looked like a man who understood something about the long aftermath of other people's decisions, the way they sat in you for years before you found the shelf to put them on. "Come on," he said after a moment. "Let's get off this dock." They went back to this penthouse. She didn't decide this exactly. It was the car that was waiting, and the car went where it went, and she didn't redirect it, which was its own kind of decision. The penthouse was high enough that the city below it looked abstract. All pattern and light, the grid of streets and the scattered clusters of towers. The dark space of the harbor she'd just left visible as a negative shape against the lit waterfront. She stood at the window for a while and let the view be what it was. Large, indifferent, Beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have no interest in being observed. Cassian made coffee. She heard the sounds of it from the kitchen, specific domestic sounds that were incongruous with everything that had preceded them, and were, for that reason, steadying. He brought it to her. She took it. They stood at the window. "The foundation," she said. He looked at her. "The recovered works," she said. "The pieces from the shipment, the ones with provenance flags. Once they're returned to their claimants, there are going to be others. Sarvin's channel ran for 31 months. There'll be works in the chain that can't be claimed because the original ownership records are lost. Works with no living claimants. Works that get seized and sit in a government warehouse and eventually disappear into bureaucracy." She looked at the city. There's a better use for them. "A foundation," he said. "An art foundation. Using recovered works as the permanent collection. Not a private collection. Public access. Educational programming. Authentication services for institutions that can't afford them." She held the coffee cup with both hands. "You have the building contacts. I have the eye. The recovered works fund the initial operating costs if they're handled correctly." He was quiet. She could feel him considering it the way he considered everything, fully, without performing consideration. "That's not a small project," he said. "No. It'll take years to do properly." "Yes." "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. Not accusatory, just reading the texture of it. "Since the gallery closed," she said, "I just didn't have the infrastructure." She looked at him. "Or the leverage." Something crossed his face that she was beginning to recognize as the thing that lived behind the flatness when he was genuinely moved by something and was deciding how much of that to allow visible. He let a small amount of it through. Not a smile exactly, but adjacent. "All right," he said. She looked at him. "All right." "Yes." She turned back to the window. The city below did its patient, indifferent thing. She drank the coffee, which was good, dark, no sugar, exactly right, without her having specified it. "My father," she said after a while. "What about him?" "I need to talk to him," she said. "Not tonight, but I need him to understand what he did, not to punish him, just—" She stopped, found the sentence. "He needs to know that I know, and I need him to know that I'm not carrying it for him anymore. Whatever he does with the house and the money and the rest of his life, he does it himself." "Yes," Cassian said. "You're not going to argue that he's your business." "No," he said. "He's not my business." She set down Bot with the coffee cup on the window ledge. Behind her, the fireplace was going. She'd noticed it when they came in without registering it fully, the warmth of it moving through the room. She turned from the window and looked at it, and she thought about the sweater, the mustard wool with the moth hole near the shoulder, the $32 armor she'd constructed against a situation she hadn't known how to face any other way. She'd left it here, she realized. When she'd changed into the red dress, she'd left it in the car, and someone had brought it up with the other things. And it was folded on the side table near the entrance where someone with careful professional habits had placed it without comment. She picked it up. It was lighter than it looked. That was the thing about armor. It felt heavier than it was. The weight was never really in the material. She looked at it for a moment. The color of old mustard. The moth hole. The specific shabbiness of something chosen for its shabbiness. Then she walked to the fireplace and put it in. The wool caught slower than she expected, then all at once. The smell was brief and specific, and then gone. She watched it go, the shape of it holding for a moment in the heat before it didn't. Cassian watched from across the room. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to say anything. Some things were complete in themselves. She stood at the fireplace until there was nothing left of it but heat. Then she turned around. He was still at the window, the city behind him, the coffee in his hand, watching her with the same expression he'd had across the table at Evander when she'd told him she'd dressed in rags to make him leave. The expression of a man whose working theory had been confirmed and who was, quietly and without display, doing something with that confirmation. "I'm not wearing a white dress," she said. "When it happens, I want that clear." The corner of his mouth moved. The first time she'd seen it do that, not the controlled, assessing expression she'd cataloged across the past 24 hours, but something smaller and less managed, something that had been there underneath the machinery all along. "Clear," he said. She walked back to the window, stood beside him, not touching, just occupying the same space, looking at the same city, the harbor dark below and the grid of lights going on in every direction as far as the eye found edge. She thought about the woman who had stood at a different window 24 hours ago, on a bus she'd ridden past her stop, because she needed time. She didn't have to understand something she already knew. She thought about the folder and the photograph and the morning her father had put them on the table. She thought about Gerald Fitch's voice on the phone, thin with the effort of delivering bad news carefully. She thought about Nico Sarvin's hand setting a blade on a container in the dark, the gesture of a man running out of moves. She thought about a forged painting on a restaurant wall, and the 3 minutes it had taken to read it, and the moment she'd forgotten to be strategic and had simply been herself. "The girl in the rags," she said. Not to him exactly. "I've been her a long time." "I know," he said. "She was good at surviving," she said. "I want to keep that part." "You should," he said. "Just not the rest of it," she said. "Not the part that dresses in rags to disappear. Not the part that makes herself small enough to slip out of rooms." She looked at the city. "I'm done with small." Cassian Vale stood beside her in the high window of a city that he had spent 15 years reshaping to his purpose, and he looked at the woman next to him, not with the measuring expression of someone calculating utility, not with the flat assessment of someone building a working theory, but with the simpler and more dangerous expression of a man who has found the thing he did not know he was looking for and understands, with full clarity, the cost and the value of having found it. "The foundation," he said. "We start the paperwork next week." "Yes," she said. "The first board meeting will be difficult," he said. "There are people who won't understand what it is." "They'll understand eventually," she said. "Or they won't, and it won't matter, because the work will be done anyway." He nodded. They stood there. The city moved below them in its patient, indifferent way, full of its transactions and its histories and its 10,000 private rooms where people were in the process of becoming whoever they were going to be next. The harbor was a dark shape at its edge. The navigation markers blinked their red and green in the cold water, patient as anything, marking the way in and the way out. The fire behind them had long since taken the last of the sweater. The room smelled like wood smoke and coffee, and the faint salt memory of the harbor she'd carried in on her boots, and it was warm in the specific way rooms are warm when something has been let go in them. Not lighter, not simpler, but cleaner, cleared of the thing it had been holding. She picked up her coffee cup, finished what was in it. "I want an office," she said, "in the foundation building, my own, with a north-facing window. The light is better for looking at paintings." "Done," he said. "And I choose the staff." "Yes." "And when I tell you something is a forgery," she said, "you don't ask me to check again." He looked at her, that almost expression again, the thing that was not quite a smile but had been adjacent to one for the past several hours, moving closer each time, the way things move when they've decided on a direction. "You've never been wrong yet," he said. "No," she said, "I haven't." Outside, the city went on being the city. Below the glass and the altitude and the slow warmth of the room, it moved and negotiated and paid its prices and collected its debts and made its quiet arrangements, all of it ordinary and all of it carrying the particular weight of things that would matter to someone. A girl who had dressed in rags to be unwanted stood at a high window in a red dress and looked at all of it and did not disappear and did not make herself small and felt the specific and unfamiliar sensation of a woman who has come to the end of one story and is standing, without armor, at the beginning of a different one. She stayed at the window a long time. He stayed beside her. Neither of them spoke again for a while because what there was left to say was the kind that didn't need words. It needed time, and they had, for the first time in this compressed and burning day, something that resembled it. The fire crackled once behind them, a log settling, the sound of something spent, then quiet, then the city, breathing its cold night breath against the glass, and the two of them inside it, and the long work of whatever came next already, quietly begun.